For once.
First of all, thanks a lot for your leadership stake in it. I was personally delighted when the EPA chose not to cooperate with the Department of Natural Resources in this permitting process and would instead conduct their own.
That was the Army Corps of Engineers.
Yeah, the Corps.
That was the Army Corps of Engineers
Yeah.
that
Oh,
wouldn't.
the Army Corps.
The EPA signal in the same room.
Yeah, the EPA said the same.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know
The
that.
feds essentially didn't share the same confidence in the DNR's ability to conduct and review this permitting. But what I'd like to hear more of is, you on behalf of the tribe had written the EPA to essentially do sort of a pre-review of this whole project to see if perhaps it could be preempted or knocked out. Can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah, I can. So the EPA has I actually brought a little bit of info on that. I can show you guys later. The EPA has discretionary authority to enact a clause of the Clean Water Act that we just refer to as Section 404C. And here's the executive summary as an example. Most recently, this is an assessment of potential mining impacts on salmon ecosystems of Bristol Bay, Alaska. This has been in the news lately. Section 404C was initiated up in Bristol Bay. I think it's a $55 million salmon fishery each year up there in the Bristol Bay watershed. And there's tribes and all of that. The EPA enacted Section 404C that gave them essentially access as a reviewing regulator to gather all of the data and science they need about this place before any mining permit process and or any mine would even take place. So it's got the federal teeth to stop a mining permit process in its tracks. It has the federal teeth to stop a mine in its tracks, and it can do that at any point in the game. If a permit is applied for, it can still be enacted. If a permit is actually been awarded, it can still be enacted. If a permit in a mine is started, it can still be enacted. And there's a couple of things about that. One is the Bristol Bay project was started by a very, very unbelievably incredible letter that's filled with lots of legal and technical data about are from 6 tribes up in the Bristol Bay watershed. And the tribes were very influential in having that enacted for a number of reasons. And to that end, what I'll say is I'm going to cheat with my cheat sheet here for a second just to get the right lingo. But under Section 404C, the EPA may exercise a veto over the specs of the Corps or of the state of a site for the discharge of a dredge or fill material. The EPA may also prohibit or otherwise restrict the specs of a site under 404C with regard to any existing or potential disposal site, and then it talks about before, during, or after permits have been issued. So basically, when we look at what the mining company wants to do here, and what you're trying to sell all of us as something that's benign and safe, when you think of the wetlands, the streams, the creeks, all of that stuff being filled with waste rock, the EPA can essentially, say BS. They can call that BS card out and say we're going to analyze this as to what the true impacts are. We're not going to wait around for a mining company to try and commandeer what science is and then piecemeal information to us like they do in Captain Step, right? You don't need the core samples. The EPA can say, we'll take it over. Why don't you guys get out of the way? Well, they can probably, I don't know how that would go down, but the EPA essentially takes over the full authority of the mine site area and the environmental assessments. What's interesting about that is the fact that it's discretionary authority. And why that's interesting is the Bristol Bay project in Alaska, well, I'll back up a little bit. The Section 404C hurdle that's in the consideration of whether or not to put it into play is that we're talking about quote-unquote aquatic resources of national interest. Now, when you go to Bristol Bay and you're looking at a $55 million salmon fishery and all the salmon, 90% of the salmon on the market comes from that watershed, you can easily extrapolate out big picture and go, man, that's a United States issue right there. You know, there's a salmon fishery and everything else, right? National interest, that notion of aquatic resource of national interest is met. I don't think there's many people that would debate that. When we push for this, we're going to sit here and we're going to have to paint a picture of the little, I guess you'd say, when you think of it in terms of the United States, we're going to have to paint the picture of the Bad River watershed being an aquatic resource of national interest. And my take on that, you know, because I thought, like, on my heart on this, like, well, how are we going to do that? There's a whole story of environmental richness that we can start with. 2 Class A trout streams and trout and sturgeon and walleye fisheries and all of that stuff. You got 40% of the Lake Superior wetlands sitting there dovetailed into the big lake. And I would say those wetlands are essentially a form of dialysis, right? Cleansing and filtering and taking. The Iron Range waters don't just stay right there on the lake shore, the north shore of Minnesota. Those waters are moving all around, right? And 40% of the wetlands of Lake Superior has a big filter cleansing system. The Pecogastos Bad River Wetlands Complex is sitting there waiting to interact with that stuff, right? So the notion that stuff is there, that 40% wetlands, I would say this is something that most people don't talk about. As an example, big muskie in the Bad River, in the heat of summer, they don't go back out to Lake Superior where the water's cold. They migrate higher up into the watershed, closer to the Penokee Mountains, because of the water temperature. It's cooler up there, so they can remain in shallows and still be in nice cool water rather than cooking in the sun, right? The reason that water is cooler in the upper watershed of the Bad River is because of the unbelievable cold water infusion that is coming off the Penokee Hills. That groundwater, surface water, groundwater activity is really complex when you look at the hydrology up there. The fact that groundwater interacts with surface water and actually becomes groundwater again in some cases is really a complex thing to try and for any hydrologist to study. But one of the end results of that is by the time it finally hits a stream where it's coming down into the lower lands and upper Lake Superior, it's incredibly cold, you know? And from a big lake perspective, I go back to the beginning when I was talking about Lake Superior having a fever, that cold water infusion component in the form of, I can't put my mind around it, I just say umpteen trillions, right? Of gallons, I don't know if that'd be a day or an hour or you know what, but let's just say 24/7, year after year after year after year. That cold water infusion out in Lake Superior has got to be looked at as a resiliency factor for the big lake. If you start looking at it as a resiliency factor for the big lake, all of a sudden it becomes a national issue because eventually the Great Lakes are going to be in everybody's crosshairs for fresh water. No one's going to Vegas or Cali if we start running into water shortages, right? So there's all of those environmental sides of that. But the biggest thing in my book, and one that I'm really pushing, and I'm still in the process of polishing up as how to talk about it, but I'm putting it out to other tribal leaders too. The biggest thing that the Bad River watershed has going for it by way of meeting that criteria of national interest is the fact that a sovereign tribe sits in the drainage basin of this particular project and watershed system. The hydrological flow is directly into a sovereign nation. So there's this way of looking at it. I wrote about this a while back, and I used the example of a dust devil on the side of a country road. Little tiny dust devil rolling like that. You look at it, and it looks just like what? Tornado, right? In spirit, that little bitty dust devil is a tornado. It's no different than a F5 ripping across countryside, right? You think of that transfer of spirit. It's different scale, but it's really the same thing. And I even use the example of frac sand or beach sand. When you look at beach sand and you realize that it's actually just a jumble of little bitty tiny rocks.